then probably, moderation should come with its own health warning. So, like they have on cigarette packets, warning, moderation could be detrimental to your health. And so I really think that that's probably correct. So let's, I think I might have it back now. So I'm going to come back to it. Okay. So let's share that. Okay. Can you see that, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just kind of set the scene a little bit, because I think that's important in terms of our discussion. So the first thing is to really get into this. So why is it, why is this such an issue? So it's all very well, that this thing, but why, so why is this now all of a sudden something we need to talk about? Well, the fundamental issue here is that this is what we've managed to get to, and I shared this last week as well when we spoke a little bit about, where we currently are, particularly with regards to chronic disease. So we know that chronic disease is following the very similar sort of curve that we saw with COVID-19, except there's no flattening. Flattening's not happening. So we know that today, around about 100, just short of 115,000 people, 111,000 people die every single day from diseases that they should not die from. And surely that's something that, that we should be thinking about. So despite our very best efforts over the last, and chronic disease is new, we're talking about the 1950s. That's not that long ago. Our parents' generation were born then. They were teenagers then. So we're not talking about, something that's ancient history here. So from then till now, we know that whatever we have done in our attempt to control the growth of NCDs or non-communicable disease, we failed. And that's, the facts are the facts. So, but I know you don't like this analogy. I do know that. But for me, it makes sense, because it must be maybe it's a boy thing, talking pictures. And so for me, when we started to understand, and this came from, it was probably less than 10 years old, this principle that, hold on a sec, if we're trying to solve something, why don't we go back and have a look at when it was right? So instead of trying to figure out how to fix it going forward, maybe it's been right before. So, one of the issues that this came out of books like Sapiens and so on, which was anthropologist driven. So a bunch of people started to get together and said, okay, when was humanity the healthiest? Because maybe we should kind of get there. So, and that's where my sort of analogy of, your DNA is like a benevolent aunt. And I think so many of us think that DNA is that thing that tells us, what color your eyes are going to be and how tall you're going to be and so on. But we know that it's significantly more complex than that. So our DNA is a code. It's a code that is a result of 1.9 million years worth of experience. That's ultimately what our DNA does. So if you think about it in terms of a benevolent aunt, I always say to patients that we speak to, if you've got someone in your family that loves you very much, that cares about you, but just doesn't believe your PR, that's kind of where I want to try and keep that analogy, because I have a boss like that. So, if Jennifer Turgis ever sees this, she'll probably have a giggle, because she was one of those people, that even on the phone, she's got bright blue eyes. I could, before I'd even met her, I could see her eyes right through me, and I knew that she just wasn't believing the stuff that was coming out of my mouth. So if you think about it in that context, your DNA is like that. Your benevolent aunt has got spies in every single cell in your body. And essentially, I also like to think of her with this big code book in one hand and a bunch of keys in the other, because that's really, so she's got this code of experience over the last 1.9 million years. So we know that human DNA has been found 1.9 million years old, human DNA. So our DNA is, it changes very slowly. So she's got a code against which she says, okay, if it gets colder, we do this. If it gets hotter, we do this, and so on and so forth. So, and her job, our creator gave her one job, and that's balance. So homeostasis, balance. So she's trying to keep everything in balance. So, so she's got a code that helps her do that. Well, so, and this is really the starting point for me for tonight's discussion, because if we're going to say moderation, then the question has to be moderation in relation to what? It's all very well to say, okay, moderation, let's do things in moderation, but what are we comparing against? And I think this is really important as a starting point, because there is a school of thought, I happen to be part of that school of thought, that says just prior to the advent of mass agriculture, human beings were probably the healthiest, and obviously not the most advanced, and I'm talking about the healthiest. And again, people who say, okay, but we've eradicated smallpox and we've got all these modern medical techniques. That is not healthcare. That's just managing sick care. So yes, more people survive because we don't have as much infectious disease and babies don't die as much in childbirth, but that is not healthcare. That's sick care. So we must separate out the two. So if we understand that, what is the code? What does our DNA expect us to do? Because that is obviously what all the processes in our body are designed against. So let's just run through these quickly, because I think this is the moderation. Physical activity, let's start there. So just prior to mass agriculture, our ancestors would have done 350 minutes or so of moderate activity per day, or 180 minutes of vigorous activity per week. If we move over to the nutrition block, and this is one that I know you and I have discussed a lot, is that our ancestors would have eaten 100 different foods per week. So that's not varieties of the same foods. So it's not sweet potato and it's different, completely different foods altogether in 1 week. And it was obviously very high quality, because there was no pesticides. We weren't doing any of that. We weren't, over farming land. So the quality was very high. And there was obviously, when you eat 100 foods, your variety is very high. And because you're moving around, you're eating seasonally. So, all of these things were in balance there. If you move across to what we speak about, gut health, and this I know is a big part of what you do in functional medicine. We didn't have alcohol. There was no low or very low alcohol. There was no or very low processed foods. In fact, there was no processed foods. And we had this balance between pro and anti-inflammatory, foods. And that balance was 1-to-1. And it was you that introduced me to a talk. I think it was Hein Barnard who did it, where he said, look, the fact is every cell in our body needs one anti-inflammatory and one pro-inflammatory molecule, one omega-6, one omega-3. And that allows our cells to be supple and do all that they need to do and allow nutrients in and so on. And today we know that is not the case. So we'll get to that in a second. If I go down to, so physical activity as well, our fight or flight response was programmed to protect us from, something was trying to eat us or a fight. So, and that's all that happened. So every time we were stressed, we would either run or fight. But it always involved movement. So that was the key. And then when we come along to nutrition, there was no or low food security. It meant that, 12-hour to 16-hour fasts were common, were every day. And there was definite ratio between effort and availability of food. So that effort versus availability is also very important. Walking to the fridge is not effort. So, that's a very different thing. So, and because, we were moving regularly, it also meant that sometimes we would fast for 24 hours or longer. And if we just move at the end of this block, so in terms of coping, or I hate the word stress management, it doesn't really ring right, but healthy coping, while we rose with the sun, we slept with the sun. So that was very important. We also had regular patterns. We ate at a certain time, we slept at a certain time, we worked at a certain time. We had very strong community bonds. It was groups. We were obviously hunters and gatherers. And we had this cortisol balance, and cortisol is obviously our stress hormone. So that is what I believe our benevolent aunt is expecting in terms of what she has to do to balance things. Well, here's today's version of moderation. And this is what I think, we are confusing. So physical activity, we know we get less than 150 minutes a week. We have very reduced insulin sensitivity. We've lost the ability to metabolize fat and protein. On the nutrition side, we eat between 3 and 10 different foods a week. It's very low quality. And obviously the variety is low. And we've got this principle that we buy what we want. So we're driving home from work, a phone, what do you feel like for dinner? You go to shop, you buy it. As opposed to understanding that, no, whatever's seasonally available was what we would have eaten. So, on the gut health side, we've got regular alcohol intake. The average adult consumes 60 kilograms of sugar per year. So if you lay out 61 kilogram bags of sugar, that's what we consume. Our fight or flight response very rarely involves movement. It just involves sitting and steaming behind a computer, or someone cuts you off in the traffic, or you've forgotten to pay the babysitter or whatever. And so meat and dairy, we've suddenly become, carnivores. And I think you and I both share the view that, we're just not carnivores. If you look at our teeth, everyone says we've got canines. Our canines are only good for tearing envelopes. We're really not set up to eat meat. And we'll chat about that just now, because I know you have quite strong views there. And we've got food security. It means we don't fast. And there's no effort versus availability ratio. We just walk to the fridge. And on the coping side, it's a complete mess. We sleep well after sunset. We've got no patterns of eating, sleeping, or working. We've got very weak community bonds now. We're pretty much on our own. And, there's this cortisol imbalance. So that's kind of where we are now. Now, this isn't new. So we knew this in 2004. This was the published, Time magazine article in 2004 that said we know inflammation is the cause of pretty much every chronic disease that we face today. Okay, so this is what I posted this week, because I kind of went, okay, what are we doing? And this kind of really came into because this is an example of human beings doing stupid stuff. Because, and this is really for me the crux of this discussion. If you have a look today, moderation means today, if you look at these 4 things. Added sugar, 70% of adults consume sugar above the limit that we know is harmful. 89% of adults consume sodium above the upper limit. Upper limit, not harmful limit, the upper limit. 71% of adults consume saturated fat above the upper limit, and the same with refined grains. So we now consume foods that we know are harmful in quantities we know are harmful. And if you move over to the things that we should do, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, beans and peas, and then exercise, well, the number is pretty much the same. So 75% below the limit on fruit, 87 below the limit on vegetables, 95 below the limit on grains, 90% on beans and peas, and 73% on exercise. So now means we do things that we know are beneficial. We don't do the things we know are beneficial. And if we do them at levels that are below the minimum to get any benefit. So that kind of says, well, that's just dumb, And I was having a chat with a patient, you'll know, I won't mention his name, very smart guy, very, very thoughtful. And I used the analogy of the frog. If we've always learned this, that we say, if you put a frog into warm water and you boil it slowly, they'll just sit in there and boil to death. And if it's very hot, they'll jump in and jump out. And he looked at me, and he said, frogs don't do that. And I was like, he said, frogs are not stupid. When the water gets too hot, they'll jump out. And but human beings, we it looks like we are the ones that are just sitting in the water and boiling to death, because we know that this stuff is the case. But why do we do it? So that's kind of where we started. So I got this slide really from your work, and I want to kind of maybe start there. I must just skip here. And maybe ask you, from your perspective, if you look at those, you speak about, those 3 circles as being, the fundamental driver of disease, which is inflammation, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and then, environmental, toxicity. And there's a bunch of things in each of those that I think are worthwhile talking about. But I think tonight, maybe it's a good place to start and to look at things that are so endemic in our society, and that's meat and dairy. and because if we're trying to say, well, what's moderation mean? What would your view be? So if I said to you from a meat and dairy perspective, is there moderation? So let's maybe start with dairy. Is there a scenario where moderation is okay?
Dairy for most people, people can't actually process dairy, and it's not only the lactose. There's also it's also about the protein in the dairy molecules, and it's one of the most inflammatory foods. So that and actually gluten are the biggest causes of inflammation and food intolerances in most people.
So I know I've heard you say that before. Okay, so let's make sure we understand. So you're saying that there isn't a scenario for most people, and I think that figure, if I'm not mistaken, is well over 70%, closer to 80%.
75.
Of every human being on the planet has some degree of lactose intolerance. Is that correct? And what's the reason for that lactose intolerance?
They don't have the enzyme that can break down the lactose.
So should we be drinking?
So most people, once they are weaned, they lose that capacity, that they lose that enzyme.
And I suppose there's a good evolutionary reason for that, if you think about it. So fundamentally, if it was so good to keep drinking your mother's milk, why would you stop? Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think so.
So there's an evolutionary mechanism that says after you've been weaned, you don't want to keep drinking your mother's milk because it's probably not good for you. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's why you move on to solid foods.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we have an entire world society. Pretty much every human society on planet Earth consumes dairy products. And I suppose the message here is that, that's just us going, okay, moderation's okay, and every generation saying that, and it's just not okay. And Jenny, what about so you mentioned gluten, and it wasn't necessarily just maybe just talk a little bit more about gluten and why. Does that have the same? Is that the same issue? Do a large number of people?
It is, yes. It is, yeah, absolutely. And it is a similar reason. So we just don't have the capacity to actually break down the protein in gluten, which is called gliadin. So it actually causes a lot of damage in the gut, typically after eating it, for a couple of hours after eating it. The only way to really work it out is to cut it out for a period of time and then reintroduce and see what your reaction is. And it's because we're consuming so much of it. It's in almost everything that we eat.
But okay, so give us an example. So where do we find gluten, of the obvious ones and maybe the not so obvious ones?
Well, gluten is in obviously all your wheat. So your breads, your pastas, anything containing wheat. It's also in rye, it's in barley, it's in spelt, and then it's also in oats. Oats is typically through contamination because it gets processed with wheat. So you can buy gluten-free oats. But yeah, those are typically your gluten-containing grains. So anything containing those grains would be gluten-based.
And that's a massive part of our packaged foods.
It's most of your sauces, your processed foods, tinned foods, a lot of them, your condiments and so on. So yeah, you've got to read labels.
Yeah, you've got to read labels. And again, this is something, that I've been obviously learning about with you, but One of the things that struck me about this label reading exercise, when I started to look at the number of different words for sugar, was in school. And my understanding is there's 63 different versions, 63 different words that you might find on a food label. That's basically added sugar.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for the majority of us, we've now got to become biochemists and so on to actually determine whether or not something that you buy at a shop is healthy.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's, I think that kind of defines maybe the extent of the problem, is how big an issue this is. And, moderation is so therefore moderation myth, it's a myth, it's fundamentally a myth. Moderation is not, it's probably the most dangerous thing we could say to our kids and our friends and our family and our colleagues and our patients, because fundamentally it's just not right. There's no evidence to support that moderation works at all.
So the issue is, both, certainly with both dairy and gluten, is that they typically they upregulate your immune system. So they trigger your immune system, and they cause food intolerances, which is different to food allergies. Okay, so it's a much more subtle reaction. It can take several hours to develop, but or even days.
Okay.
But so it triggers the immune system to react against those food particles. And that's why you've got to eliminate them for a period so that you can kind of calm the immune system down again.
Yeah.
And depending on how severe the reaction is, the time period could vary. So ultimately, I mean, if you can settle it down enough, you can start to reintroduce those foods. Not all the time, but you should be able to tolerate them again at some point.
Yeah.
So it's not a permanent elimination. It may be for some people, obviously.
Yeah.
But it certainly is for a period.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just coming back to could you just define quickly for everyone food intolerance, food allergy? I think that, because for me that often became this something similar. So could you so what's the difference?
A food allergy it triggers a different part of your immune system. So that triggers your immunoglobulin E, okay, which is one particular immunoglobulin that you have in your immune system.
Okay.
And it typically will set off like an anaphylactic shock reaction, or like swelling, or like red patches,
okay,
or a swollen tongue, or
so something very obvious.
And it happens within minutes. Okay, so yes, so you would know if you have a food allergy to something. Absolutely. A food intolerance is much more subtle. So it can be almost anything. It can be obviously digestive issues, gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, all of those kind of things, pain. It can be joint issues or muscle pain. It can be mental issues. It can be depression. It can be brain fog, just an inability to focus clearly, and so on. So it really can be lots of different things, and it typically can take a few hours to up to 2 days to really feel those reactions. So it's much more subtle. It's much more difficult to pinpoint, and that's why really the only way to do that, the best way to do it, is through an elimination diet, and to eliminate it for a significant period, and then slowly reintroduce and monitor what your reaction is to that food.
But am I right in saying that because it's so subtle, we kind of get used to it? So,
yeah.
So
I mean, lots of things.
Yeah.
We learn to live with pain, and people think it's normal. I'm getting older. It's just, I'm stiff. I'm sore. I've got, whatever issue. I
mean, we have that every day. In practice, we hear every day patients saying, "Oh, sorry, I got back pain, but it's okay." No, it's not okay. But just coming back to the subtlety. So, you sent me something on Instagram a while ago that said we don't know how good we can feel. So it was something like that. So most people don't know how good they're supposed to feel.
Absolutely. We're so used to feeling, I mean, we're used to surviving. We're used to getting through the day. And we think it's normal.
As opposed to living, I suppose.
As opposed to thriving.
Yeah. Okay. I want to stay on this topic for a bit. Something that you brought to my attention a while ago that I did not know, and that is that processed meat. That we take, absolutely as, and the advertising that's behind it is just, it's massive. So processed meat. Am I correct? Processed meat is a level 1 carcinogen. In other words, in the same category as cigarette smoking, for example, and plutonium, as an example.
Yes, it is. That's how it's been classified.
So bacon, ham, sandwich meat, etc.
Hamburgers, frankfurters, Viennas, all of those things, absolutely.
And I suppose now the question is, well, why don't we know? But this was published by the World Health Organization, I think, back in, 2004. So it's not something that, oh no, it wasn't. It was later than that. It wasn't. I think it may have been less than 10 years ago, but I can confirm that. But the bottom line is, it comes down to the voice that's loudest. So the WHO doesn't have a big marketing budget. They publish this and they hope that healthcare professionals are going to take this, or people are going to read it, but they just don't. And the processed meat industry's got a massive budget and they can just drown you out.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And one more thing. Again, something new for me is that what's this about grilling meat? As an example, we're staying on this meat and dairy topic. So, South African, it's bringing braai. Braai is part of our culture. Tell me a little bit about why, for example, grilling meat is just not a great idea.
It causes specific compounds. I can't think of the name right now. It's glycated end products in the meat, particularly like if you like burning it a bit or whatever, and those are significantly carcinogenic. It's actually the same. Burning toast will have the same impact and so on. So any of that, it's not a good idea. With meat, the best way to have it is really to boil it.
Yeah.
So to grill it or to fry it is not a great way to have it. It is more carcinogenic. And again, things like beef, it's also quite a big trigger, or can be for people.
And why specifically beef is? Oh, okay. So we're talking about like highly farmed or factory farmed. Is that right?
I don't think that's the only reason. It's also a type of protein, and there is a specific thing in red meat that is more difficult to digest. So yeah.
So the scale of the problem, hopefully, is becoming clear. You're talking about, this principle that we say, well, a little bit of red meat is okay. And I think, having one now and again is not the end of the world. And I think that's,
the issue with moderation, okay, if we come back to something like gluten or dairy, is as I was saying, it upregulates your immune system. So until you've settled it down completely to like a normalized state again, if you have like it can even be as much as a crumb of gluten.
Oh, wow.
Can start to trigger that immune system again. So then it starts to build up antigens and antibodies against those antigens, and it just triggers that whole cycle. So that's why you've really got to eliminate it completely. It can even be in a lot of spices they use gluten as one of the ingredients. So you've got to be really careful to eliminate it completely for long enough to allow your immune system to completely settle down again so that it doesn't start reacting against it, and that it calms down properly.
And then if you've got this constantly triggered immune system, one of the things that you and I looked at specifically when we were looking at how we dealt with metabolic disease, for example, we used a methodology that is, it's documented and so on, it's ketogenic, so let's look at removing sugar, from a patient's diet. And that then drops inflammation dramatically, and you can start to manage metabolic disease. But you said to me, no, hold on a second. Why are we doing that? Because, fundamentally by upping the animal protein and upping the fat, we're probably doing the same thing. So, and I remember thinking, well, that's, how are we going to do this then? How do you physically do it? But the study that I really looked at, which was fascinating, was where they isolated a few things. One, they said, okay, let's look at animal fat, which was cream. So they used an animal fat as an individual trigger. So basically what they were doing is giving a group of subjects various different food substances and seeing what it did to the immune system and how long it did it for. So they used cream as an animal fat. They used orange juice, pure orange juice. So in other words, straight from the fruit. Then they used sugar water, which is obviously how to take processed sugar, a processed type of sugar. Then they used water, obviously, as a control group. And then in meats, they used a Wagyu beef, which is obviously the most farmed version of beef that you can imagine. And they used a wild meat, like kangaroo, for example. And then they wanted to see what happened to the immune system. And the amazing thing was cream, meat, and processed sugar all trigger the immune system immediately. And
inflammation.
And absolutely. Trigger the inflammatory markers. So they measured all those inflammatory markers, the IGs, and they measured, ultra-sensitive CRP, all of those type of markers, which we know are indicators of inflammation. And that those substances would trigger your immune system for 3 hours and up to 5 hours, which absolutely blew my mind. Because if you do the maths, you've got 3 meals in a day, and your immune system is triggered for 5 hours per time. That's 15 hours. Now, if you do that over and over again every day, well, aren't you going back exactly where you started? Because that's acute inflammation. Everyone was like, it's not acute inflammation, it's a problem. It's chronic inflammation, it's a problem. But if your immune system is triggered for 5 hours a day or 15 hours a day, every day, that's chronic inflammation, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we're back where we started. And I think that was really what kind of got me thinking, was to say, well, that it may work in the short term. So a ketogenic, a high animal-based protein diet may work in the short term, but it's got no long-term sustainability. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
So we have a problem. So we have a problem. So we know that moderation just is not something that, so we cannot use that excuse anymore. I think that's really the message here. But so what do we do, and how do we actually, manage our way out of this, out of this scenario? And I don't think tonight's really about the answer, although I think some of it is understanding that if you want to be well, if you really want to be well, and I think, our strapline on our website is a good one, to cope in an unhealthy world, you have to be so absolutely healthy that your very existence is an act of rebellion. And I think, fundamentally today, if you want to ask yourself, how free do you want to be? Well, the answer is not easy. I don't think it's complicated. Don't eat gluten, don't eat dairy. Don't eat animal protein, because we are not designed to eat animal protein. We are not carnivores. Yeah, it's difficult to implement. So it's simple, but it's certainly not easy. And I know that's something you tell your patients from a functional medicine perspective. You better be ready to do this. It's a simple process, but it sure ain't easy, I always say, like our dogs are omnivores. They eat. Human beings are not omnivores. We can't eat like that. I don't understand how anybody could think that we were carnivores at any stage. Anyway, that's another debate altogether. So I think the answers are simple, but the implementation is really, really difficult. And I think we're going to talk further on this because food is only one issue. We've got to then decide, okay, you eat while you come home. What kind of toxic load so the whole environmental toxicity thing is I think something that will really shock people, because it's certainly, shocking me. Every single time you expose me to another, piece of data about this, it's absolutely frightening. And I think that's probably where we'll go to next in this particular topic. So, food and exercise, food and activity is one thing, but we're certainly not out the woods either, just by looking at those two. So the other two big blocks, oxidative stress, and what happens when we are under constant stress and we don't manage that, I think is something for the next topic. And then, give everyone a breather, and then we'll look at environmental toxicity, because, just, understanding that we live in a toxic space. We live in a toxic world. I knew nothing about heavy metals. I knew nothing about the impact of personal products, skincare products, household products, and what are they doing to us? It sometimes leaves me exhausted.
What we breathe.
And what we breathe, absolutely. But the bottom line is, I think the message for everyone today is that moderation. There's no value in that statement. Saying moderation is okay. It's just it's dangerous, and we have to decide as individuals, and as a society, how free we want to be. Because if we continue like this, well, then we will be the frogs. The frogs would have jumped out the water. The only things left in the water will be human beings, because we're the only ones dumb enough to continue to do this stuff to ourselves. Agreed?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've run through our time, and it's time to wrap up. So, Jenny, as always, thank you very much for your time and your expertise.